Welcome to Parallel Lives. I'm Dimmer, and this is my co-host, Levi.
Hello.
Today, we're talking with Anna, a mental health therapist in the United States with maladaptive daydreaming. So she's not a maladaptive daydreaming therapist. She's a therapist with maladaptive daydreaming. And she's going to kind of give us her perspective on that. We had the audience generate kind of some questions, and we're just going to go through and sort of talk about what the community wants to know. I guess we should start, right at the beginning with, what do you do?
Like professionally?
Professionally, sorry. Because therapist is very, very broad, you know?
Yes, definitely. So I'm a mental health therapist, and I actually work in a healthcare setting, so it's kind of like an integrated primary care, actually. So what that means is I work alongside doctors and nurses and dietitians and kind of provide holistic care for our patients. So, but I do counseling. Like, I have a caseload of patients who I see for weekly sessions, sometimes bi-weekly sessions, just depending on what the patient is needing. And I've been there for going on 3 years now. I really enjoy it a lot. So it's kind of functions like a private practice, but it's not a private practice. So by that, I mean, my patients come through the other medical providers, like my referrals do. So I can kind of collaborate with them about meds and other forms of treatment and those kinds of things. So what you picture when you picture a therapist, or if any of you have been to therapy before, that's probably very similar to what I do.
I got to ask the obvious question. Do you have any patients who are maladaptive daydreamers?
Okay, so let me just actually also give this disclaimer. When I talk about patients, I will obviously not be giving names or any identifying information, and I'll probably change a few things just to protect people's identities. So I do, I have this one patient who has been in therapy for a very long time, much longer than with me, of course. And she presented with several comorbid diagnoses. And maladaptive daydreaming wasn't one of them that she presented with, according to her. But as she started talking I'm pretty sure it was actually the intake session, it became pretty clear to me that was something that was going on for her, because she started talking about her, the worlds, mainly one world or paracosm. But at that time, I didn't have that kind of language. But she was describing like a world that was in her head, and then another kind of lesser world. So there was kind of like the main one and characters. And so, of course, immediately my first thought was, like, I relate to that, and I didn't say that, of course, but I was just asking more questions about it. And the thing that really helped me to kind of solidify that is probably what's going on for her is that she said that her former therapist, who she'd been seeing forever, it felt like many decades, her former therapist was wonderful and they did a lot of good work together. And she would describe this to her former therapist. And the thing that she said that stuck with me was, the patient said, my therapist was always a little bit concerned and would voice concern that at some point I was going to have to choose between realities, and that I was not going to choose this one to live in. And I was like, all right, that's definitely what's going on. And I asked her if she knew about maladaptive daydreaming, and she didn't. So honestly, though, as far as her treatment plan goes, that is not something that she's wanting to address at this time. she has a lot of other more pressing, some of them safety related issues. So I actually see her maladaptive daydreaming, which honestly, I feel like for her in particular, it might be falling more into the immersive daydreaming kind of realm recently as she developed healthier attachments and different coping strategies. So I think it is being treated in a sense, but it's not been the focus of treatment. In fact, it's probably, at least in my clinical opinion, it's been more of a protective factor for her. And by that, I mean a resource, like something that she can pull from and go to when she needs to, but it doesn't seem to have as much control over her at this time, which is why I'd say it's probably closer to the immersive daydreaming realm. So we haven't like actively treated it, but it does seem like just through the course of her therapy, it's kind of been, I don't want, not addressed is not the right word, but I think you know what I'm trying to say. So that's my experience with like clinically with somebody who has it. It would be really interesting if somebody came in and was like, this is my main issue that I want to deal with, because I've not had that happen.
Yeah, honestly, I'm surprised you even have one. I expected you to be like, no, nobody's mentioned it
Yeah.
yet.
Well, me too. And that's why I asked all the questions, because I was like, is this real? She's like a unicorn. And yeah, and again, like her therapist she had seen like a clinical psychologist who was very well trained and had been in practice for many decades. And that person didn't know about maladaptive daydreaming, as many mental health professionals don't.
Did you learn about maladaptive daydreaming before you went into therapy, or did you sort of find out about it while you were working as a therapist?
So, yeah, that's a great question. I definitely found the language for it and found out about it being a real thing after I was practicing as a therapist. So, really within the last 3 years, which is kind of crazy to think about. But I mean, I personally have been maladaptive daydreaming for as long as I can remember. It's always been a major part of my life and was something I actually kind of like vetted for myself before I went back to school. I actually spoke with a therapist about it, tried to. It's the only time I've ever brought it up in therapy, my personal therapy. And it didn't go very well. And so I felt even more weird. I always kind of felt a little weird with it just because it's kind of an odd thing to do. And I knew that. And so when I found out what it was, finally, it was a huge, well, I think it's interesting because if I'm being honest, I almost said it was a huge relief to find out that there was this real thing. And that's partially true. Also, I partially felt like, wow, I thought I was the only one that did this. Like, I don't know if it's like I felt a little bit less unique or something. I don't really know, but it was almost like a mixed emotional experience. I think I didn't really know what to think or feel, but it's definitely after I started practicing that I found the research and read it and kind of developed a clinical conceptualization.
I can imagine that, like, having a patient who may have either immersive daydreaming or maladaptive daydreaming is like, it's a pretty big deal, especially
Mhm.
if you're working as a therapist and you talk to someone who you can relate to, and you know like I don't know, it's very strange to think about, like talking to other people, and as they're explaining, you're like, wow, I can actually relate to this. So yeah,
Mhm.
that's pretty cool.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I remember one of my instincts in the moment when she was sharing, because I've seen a lot of patients, it feels like, and sometimes they can blur together, but this intake session with this particular patient really stands out to me in my memory. And I remember my instinct, like my primary instinct, was to reassure her that this was like a real thing that she was experiencing, and not to minimize it, and also not to like escalate it or something, make it out to be something just inherently negative. I wanted to like set the stage for her to see it as a resource. And I also didn't want to minimize it and be like, oh, you're just creative, or you just have a really vivid imagination. Those two, it was like really important to me to kind of communicate something different than that. And that's probably more about me than her in some ways, because that's probably how I wanted to be talked to.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that because you mentioned a minute ago that it did not go well with your therapist, your personal therapist. Like how did that go?
Yeah, that sounds more dramatic than it was. It wasn't really traumatic or anything, but it was just invalidating. That's probably how I would describe it. So let's see. I was in therapy. I've been in quite a bit of my own therapy, but I was seeing a therapist when I was mid-20s or something. It was like 23, maybe 22. And so I was really young. And I was seeing this man who had been in practice for a long time. Again, he's an excellent clinician in many ways. And one of the reasons I was seeing him was because I was wanting to leave my job and I was thinking about going back to school to become a counselor. And I was kind of processing a lot of those things. And one of the things that I set out to talk to him about was this, because part of me wondered, does this disqualify me, from being a successful clinician or someone that can help other people? Because I know that it's not quote unquote normal, even though, again, at that time, I didn't have the language. I didn't know that it was a thing. I certainly never met anybody else that did. And so I just felt like I was kind of a freak, basically, and wanted to confess that or something. I don't know. It felt kind of like a confessional, just to see if he professionally thought that was something that would like hold me back from being a good clinician. And so it took many sessions for me to work up the courage. But when I did, he was so kind in many ways. And his main goal, I could tell, was to reassure me and that I was fine, and in the way he did that, though, was from my perspective, was very like minimizing. So he said what I said I didn't want to say to that patient of mine. He said, it just sounds like you have a very vivid imagination, and it just sounds like you are very creative, and maybe you'll be an author one day. I remember he said that. And I was like sitting there and I was like, I don't think you're understanding the situation. And I tried to kind of help him. I remember I was like, well, it seems like a little bit more than just me being creative. This is like a everyday thing. And it's like a never ending story for me. And I do think it's a thing. I kept like trying to get him there. And I think he wanted me to go back to school. I think he thought he was like supportive, and his goal was kind of to reassure me, basically. But it was really invalidating. And I remember afterwards being like, I'm never bringing that up again. It's like, that was really embarrassing, So that was my experience. It probably sounded more dramatic than it was in real life, but
no, that's such a common experience for maladaptive daydreamers.
yeah, I can imagine. I can definitely see that being the case. Because as a clinician, you don't want to be like, oh, that's really bad. Like something must be really wrong with you. Like that you don't want to do really with anybody. But I think with something like this, because daydreaming itself is such a normative experience and even a healthy experience when it's done in moderation, it can be really easy to just kind of write it off. And for somebody whose life can be kind of consumed by it, that's a very invalidating thing to hear.
So how do you feel that maladaptive daydreaming's awareness should sort of be communicated in the professional field, such as, in medicine or in mental health? Um, is there a specific way that more professionals could be educated in maladaptive daydreaming, or would that be something that would be left to, let's say, the what's the DSM? Yeah, the DSM. Sorry,
Mhm.
my brain just went blank
Oh,
for.
no, you're fine. Yeah, that's a good question. And I wish I had a very clear answer for that. That's a big question. But I think so. The research that's coming out lately about maladaptive daydreaming, I find to be very compelling and impressive and helpful. Like some research that they do, it's like a great study, very solid. But it's like the results of the study just aren't very helpful clinically. But the stuff that's coming out now, first of all, there's quite a bit of it. And second of all, if somebody was to bring this to me, like if someone was to bring me an article, like a patient of mine, and say, this is what I think is going on with me, and I know that it's not in the DSM, but this is what I think is happening, I would be thrilled by that, first of all, because I would love to learn about these new things. And any therapist who's worth seeing is going to respond to that well, hopefully. And if not, you really should consider finding someone new. So, using the research to educate your personal therapist, I think, is helpful because there's many communities of clinicians who talk amongst themselves. Like I know I've educated a lot of clinicians, just my friends, and it's a pretty broad circle because you have different professional societies and cohorts in school, and then you make friends with all the therapists you work with. And so word of mouth is important, and it can kind of start with just like one therapist. So highly recommend that as just like a grassroots thing to do. I think we need even more research. And again, the more that it gets circulated in the community of clinicians, then the more money and attention that it's going to get on the research front. So that's really the key to getting something introduced to the DSM. The DSM itself, they don't even know if they're going to make a 6th edition. The
What?
jury's still out on that. I know. They're thinking. Go ahead.
No, I hadn't heard that. Little
Yeah. They're thinking that. Well, this is what I've read. So sorry if this is incorrect information, but from my understanding, they're very much considering consolidating. So they just have like an ICD code book, basically. Because the ICD codes, that's the full book of like medical diagnoses, and mental health diagnoses are included in that. And then also have their own book, the DSM. Sometimes I don't even know how to talk about these things. So I don't know what the process for getting a diagnosis recognized in the ICD is. I'm assuming it's somewhat similar, but it's not strictly mental health, is what I'm trying to say. So that kind of might complicate things because I, like a lot of you guys, I think, would hope for it to be recognized. I don't know exactly where it should be recognized. I know there's a lot of kind of debate about that, but I feel like I'm just really talking a lot. I'm sorry if I'm talking too much.
No, you're the guest. People don't care about me and Levi. They want to hear from you. um, I don't want to. So we're bad at segues, right? But I just have thoughts. And I need to ask
That's
them.
great.
Yeah, I'm gonna switch gears into something completely different, and then maybe we'll circle back because there's just so many things that come up while you're talking. I'm like, oh, we got to remember to talk about that. But the one that came to the front of my mind was and not what is maladaptive daydreaming, because I mean you're not an MD researcher. You probably can't answer that, but I see all the time in our communities, people will say, well, I think, or I experience this as just a symptom of something else, or I don't think it's a disorder. I think it's an addiction. Things like
Mm-hmm.
that. If let's just say hypothetically, if you were like scrolling through Reddit and you found a post that said like, I think it's just a symptom of something else, or I think it's an addiction, not a disorder. As somebody in the mental health field, just like how
Mm-hmm.
do you look at statements like that?
Okay. Well, another great question. Um, I will sit, let me just actually give a little bit of a disclaimer here. Like I said, work in the medical field, so I have to provide diagnoses for every interaction I have with a patient for insurance purposes. That's just a real dynamic of how the mental health industry really runs, especially here in the US. I don't know as much about in other countries, but here that's very much how it works, and heavy emphasis on diagnosis. And I personally, as a clinician and just as a human, I don't find them to be as helpful all the time. Like I think when you ask the question, what would you think if you saw a Reddit post? I would think that's the wrong question to be asking, personally. And I don't even necessarily know what the right question is. Maybe something more like, how does it function in your life, like personally? Um, so yeah, back to what I was saying about just my understanding of diagnoses. They can be really helpful in terms of medication and in terms of treatment, but they can also be less than helpful when you kind of latch onto them like really, really tightly, almost like a label, that you can kind of wear. That it just kind of, it's almost like you lose the focus on what's really happening in real life, and you latch on to this like badge or something. And I see it happen a lot with people. And because maladaptive daydreaming in particular has been shown to not really be treatable with medication, then in my mind, it doesn't seem like as important of a debate as it seems to be. However, if I really had like a gun to my head and was like being forced to answer that question, I would say I see it as more of a dissociative experience. And that's really personal for me. That's much more personal than it is my clinical understanding. Because again, I've really only worked with one person. So personally, my experience of it is more of a dissociative experience, but this is where they overlap, right? Like you can be addicted to a dissociative experience. You can be addicted to anything that provides consistency, like predictable shifts in your mood or your circumstance. We're going to get addicted to those things because in a world where people are often not consistent and circumstances are often not consistent, and we often feel very powerless as people. Anything that can give us some control, even if it's actually like actively ends up with you losing more control, it's ironic in that way or counterintuitive. But anything that in the moment can kind of instantly give you that feeling of power and control and then produce a consistent result in your life, like that, we can get addicted to that. It's just as people. You can look at substances, you can look at all kinds of disordered behavior like eating, sex, all kinds of things, and see that play out. So I don't see it as being any different than that. And I guess to sum it up, this is a really scattered response, but to sum it up, I think there's just so much overlap between a dissociative experience and a dissociative disorder and addictive behavior. And I just see them as being much more blurry than we're like wanting it to be. It'd be much nicer if you could get a blood test or something and it would say, okay, yes, this is that, but that's not how it works in mental health.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense to me. I wanted to know though, and I think that this was also a question from some users on the Discord server. Uh, so when you look at maladaptive daydreaming as such as being sort of an overlap of, let's say, a disorder, dissociation, addiction, stuff like that. Do you think that it is possible to fully, well, I say this word in quotation marks, healing is possible from maladaptive daydreaming?
Yes, definitely. And I tend to believe that we're all either moving towards healing or away from healing. And I tend to be a believer, even though I feel like I'm strongly in like the realist slash maybe even pessimist camp as far as like my life outlook. But I do feel very hopeful in the sense that I do believe that healing is possible across the board, even with really severe personality disorders and things that even clinicians will say can't be treated. I don't believe that. From my professional experience, anecdotally, from people that I know in my own life, I think humans are moving in one of two ways, and I do believe that it's possible. I don't think my goal would never be, it's not my goal for myself, and my goal for people I would work with who experience maladaptive daydreaming would never be to eliminate it from their lives. So if that's what healing would look like for somebody, then the jury's out on that, because I don't know that that's realistic or that would even be good for that person. Not that I'm the one to necessarily say that, but for me, I know that's never going to be my goal for myself. So I guess it also kind of depends on what your idea of healing is. But if your idea of healing is to have this as more of a resource in your life, and that you can, basically kind of like the immersive daydreaming construct, like this is a resource in your life that you can utilize as needed, but also have other options. Like that's not your only tool in your tool belt for managing stress or feelings of being overwhelmed or anxiety or really anything that might be underlying some of this. Then I would consider that to be movement towards healing if you have other resources you can reach for. I mean, just with dissociation, if we're seeing it like as like a form of dissociation is like our earliest, most primal resource. It's like babies can dissociate when they feel pain or stress, or they feel neglected emotionally by their caregivers. That is very threatening to a baby because they rely on that person completely for everything. So if their needs aren't getting met, they can kind of check out from reality a little bit by dissociating. And the only problem with that is when babies and little children experience so much of that, so many times when they need to do that, they need to get their needs met by kind of taking things into their own hands and dissociating, then it becomes overdeveloped. And that's when you get into issues, because the little child is not going to feel the need to reach for other resources and kind of like expand their tool belt. Another resource might be like reaching out to somebody relationally, or self-soothing in other ways, or asking for something directly. There's lots of different ways that resources can kind of come into play.
Yeah, if that doesn't sound like the perfect way to start MD, I don't know what does.
Mm-hmm.
That sounds
Yeah.
bang on. So I know you don't have like patients who are maladaptive daydreamers. You're not like, that's not your specialty or anything, but that's not anybody's specialty, because it's not an official thing. Like it's a thing, but it's not like an official thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like a diagnosis that you can get.
Yeah. There's not like evidence-based treatment that people are learning about in school. Yeah.
Yeah, so I kind of have a twofold question. Like, first of all, as a therapist, if somebody came to you with this, does that even matter? How helpful really is it to you to be able to look something up in the DSM and be like, okay, I can put that on your prescription, I can put that on your 504 or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And then I just see so many people seem to get stuck. They get stuck where they're like, well, nobody's heard of it anyway. So, like, what's a therapist even going to do for me? Why should I go anyway? They haven't heard of it. They can't treat it. So, what's the point?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I hear that very much for sure. To answer your first question about how important is that to me to be able to like look in the DSM and find a diagnosis, it's really not very important to me. And back to kind of what I said before about how, when diagnoses can be really helpful and when it almost feels like you're missing the point by trying to check boxes that are kind of subjective. Again, it's not like you can get a blood test and get a mental health diagnosis from that. It's very complicated to diagnose somebody with really almost any mental health condition. So, to me personally, it's not very important. I don't know how to make a judgment about, like, in general, how people see that, because I think it also is a function of like the setting you work in. Somebody in private practice is probably going to feel maybe a little bit more like me, maybe. I mean, that just feels like a huge generalization to make. But if they're not taking insurance, again, at least in the US, then they're not going to have some of those pressures to land on a diagnosis necessarily early on. I think that might answer your first question. The second question that's a complicated one because back to what I said earlier, I would highly recommend people bring in research articles, which you can find those on, what's the website? You guys know the website name?
The International Consortium for Maladaptive Daydreaming Research. That's a mouthful. Just Google ICMDR. We will also have a link in the description.
Yes, thank you. That's what I'm referring to. They have the articles laid out just beautifully, and you can just click on them. It's amazing, actually. It's very hard to find some of those articles if you're not using that resource. So, presenting your clinician, your therapist with those things is going to be really helpful, not because it's going to help them diagnose you formally necessarily, but because a lot of these research articles that are coming out are more about how it functions in the life of a person and less about how it fits into a diagnostic criteria. So, which again, I find to be incredibly helpful because it's talking about things like, how does this help somebody? Does this help someone emotionally regulate? By that I mean calm themselves down when they need to, get some control over their emotions in the moment. And interestingly, the research seems to show that it doesn't help with that, which is surprising to me because I always kind of felt like it did help me me with that. So, but I'm looking at myself from my own experience. So, somebody outside of me might be seeing me and seeing something very different, and the results in my life might be different. So, all of that to say, presenting your therapist with research could be really helpful. And even beyond that, I would hope that most therapists out are more interested in being curious about the experience of the person in front of them and helping to bring awareness to that, like insight as far as like what's happening for that specific person, what needs in their life are going unmet. Basically, you don't need a diagnosis. You don't even need to know what maladaptive daydreaming is for that. You can just explain what's happening, and hopefully the clinician's going to be curious enough to want to unpack that with you and explore kind of the purpose that it's serving in your life, basically, and talk about like how much distress is this causing you, because something in the DSM, most of the diagnoses in there, like at the end of each criteria list, it'll say causes significant distress or impairment in multiple spheres of life, school, home, whatever. And you have to check that one in order for it to be a diagnosis. So you could have all the symptoms, but it doesn't cause you distress, like subjectively, and you wouldn't necessarily qualify for that diagnosis. So for you to come in and say, this is distressing, hopefully is enough for somebody to pay attention. And if they're not, then you need to find a new therapist, probably. I would recommend finding a trauma-informed therapist, because I think people who are trauma-informed are going to be possibly more open to all the ways that we as humans figure out how to get through the day, basically, and how to get through things in life. And they're going to be more likely to want to honor that initially and then move towards, okay, but how can we help you find some other options so you have more choice and so that you have more control.
What's a trauma-informed therapist, though? Because I don't want to put words in your mouth, but what that sounds like to me as a layperson is find an expert in trauma, even if you don't have any.
Right. And I'm really glad you brought that up. I meant to say, so first of all, when I talk about trauma, I'm not necessarily talking about severe sexual abuse or physical abuse, or maybe you grew up in foster care or something like that. Trauma is a huge spectrum, and it can start in early childhood with some of those things I talked about earlier, like not your parent not making enough eye contact with you, for example. That can be really traumatizing for a little baby. And that's what we call, that can result in like attachment ruptures, which are considered, that's very traumatic for kids. So when I say trauma, I see that on a very broad spectrum. And I think if we all understood that a little bit more, we probably, more of us would say, yeah, I think I have experienced some of that. So there's that. But to answer your question directly, a lot of counselors are trauma informed at this point. All that means is that this is really the essence of it. You switch the question that you're asking in your head as a counselor from what's wrong with you, you switch that to let's talk about what's happened to you. And again, it's not even looking for really, really extreme things. It's more looking at, like, you as a human have lived a life where many, many things have happened. And let's talk about how you've adapted to those things, whether or not they're objectively really extreme or not. And let's talk about how those adaptations, the ways you've learned to cope, how that affects you now. Because anything can become maladaptive. Anything that's maladaptive was once adaptive. You know, at one time it was really helpful and it worked. It's the only reason why we still do it. So you can find a trauma-informed therapist by reading their bios normally. There's a website that I like to use called Psychology Today. And it is really just like a reference guide, I guess you would call it, a directory. That's what the word I'm looking for, of therapists in the US. Again, I don't have a ton of resources for people listening outside of the US, unfortunately, but at least here you can go to that website and you can actually filter therapists through like all of the, like, insurance, location, specialty. Maladaptive daydreaming is not on there, but dissociation is, and addiction is, and trauma is. So you can select, those things, and then the therapists in your area who are aware of those things and going to approach it kind of how I just described are going to pop up.
In relation to the topic of finding someone for help, it's sort of a bit of a jump in topic, but it is sort of related as well. How do you think a person's identity could be affected by maladaptive daydreaming, let's say from childhood to adulthood? Especially if someone doesn't know that they have MD, how would someone be able to sort of be changed through maladaptive daydreaming? I don't know if that makes sense, but like their identity, how that could be affected by maladaptive daydreaming.
How does maladaptive daydreaming from childhood impact your sense of identity as you kind of like grow up into adulthood? Is that kind of okay? So when I think about like personal, like your personal identity, like your sense of self, Gosh, I don't know. That one I really have to think about my own experience. So everyone else on here is, as good at probably answering this as I would be, but
I don't know if I can like put context in this. So, in short, I'm guessing it's a person without maladaptive daydreaming, how their sense of self and identity would develop, because as maladaptive daydreamers, we sort of live in our minds, right?
uh-huh.
And how would that be different for a person's identity being developed as
Mhm.
they grow older into adulthood versus someone who doesn't have maladaptive daydreaming?
Mhm. Okay. I see. So again, I feel like I'm more answering not from a clinical or professional perspective, but just from my own life. I think it's an interesting. So I have a version of me in my daydreams, and I know a lot of people do, but not everybody does. So I think when I hear that question, I immediately think about that character, you know. And I think it's a really interesting, I don't know if you call it a skill. I don't know what you call it, but an interesting thing to be able to like have so much control and power over morphing who you are and how you respond to things and how you function in a daydream setting, and then also have like your real life self where you have so much less control, right? So yeah, I still don't really know the answer, but I just think that's a really interesting. I'm going to think about that more because I think it's an interesting contrast, thinking about somebody that just walks through the world and doesn't necessarily have that. And now I'm thinking also of like someone's sense of permanence, or reality. For somebody who maladaptive daydreams, there's kind of always, I at least always have this feeling that I don't have to be here engaging here. Like I have another option. So there's much less of a sense of kind of, there can be less of a sense of like solidity, I guess. Everything kind of feels a little bit more fluid, and my sense of self can feel very, I don't want to say transient, but kind of like I can kind of switch. I mean, Dimmer, I've heard you in the other podcast episodes talk about how it's kind of constantly playing in the back of your mind. I really relate to that, where there's always kind of this, it's a very thin veil that I can kind of jump between. And that feeling of being somewhat like almost transient, or like I can hop between these two experiences. Um I don't totally know what that does to my sense of identity, but I'm sure it's different from somebody who doesn't have that ability or doesn't live with that, because they are kind of stuck with real life. And so yeah, part of me wants like research to be done on that now, because does that cause them to develop more a sense of resilience or something, because this is life, and this is, you know what they have, whereas I feel like I kind of have this alternate life that I can pop in and out of to find some relief or whatever. So this doesn't feel like all that I have, this reality.
I think it has a lot to do with people's sense of wanting to get help for maladaptive daydreaming, because a lot of people do feel that if they get help for maladaptive daydreaming, then yes, it will help with the maladaptive part of it, but it will be different, like even immersive daydreaming would be something more different than maladaptive daydreaming. And I think
Mhm.
that as maladaptive daydreamers, this is part of us. Like that's what I always tell people is that yes, we can get treatment for it, and a lot of people should get treatment for it if they feel that they need it. But at the end of the day, it's hard, it's difficult because maladaptive daydreaming is part of us. So I can imagine that that is also sort of a roadblock or an issue that would jump forward when it comes to the topic of getting help and going to therapy and stuff like that.
Yes, okay. That makes so much sense. I appreciate that you said that so much, because now I'm thinking about people I work with who in particular have like bipolar disorder is what I'm thinking of right now, because I find bipolar disorder to be one of the most difficult disorders to treat for several reasons, but one of them being the people who I've worked with bipolar disorder, which is not saying everybody, but just the people I've worked with, seem to identify with some of the symptoms of that and some of the ways that it plays out in their life, maybe more than people with other disorders. And specifically, I've heard so many times that people with bipolar disorder are very resistant to going on medication because they're afraid of what it's going to take from them. Mainly their sense of creativity, anything they might experience when they're in a manic state. So bipolar is that really intense mood fluctuation between mania and severe major depression. And what people experience when they're in their manic state, I've heard people describe it beautifully, where they talk about how when they're in a manic state, their brain is so creative and they're coming up with all of these things that they want to do. No, I'm sorry, it's the opposite of that. It's in their manic state, they're like doing all of the things that they want to do, and they're like, have this almost hyper focus and hyper sense of like invincibility and all of these things, and can make things happen for themselves in very cool ways. And then when they're going down into their depressive state, they're there for a while, and when they're there and when they're coming back up, that's when they start to dream about all that they want to do and get really, really creative. And I can't even tell you the amount of times that I've heard that story. And people are afraid that if they don't have the ups and downs of that something's going to get taken from them that feels really important to their identity. And I definitely relate to that as an individual as far as maladaptive daydreaming goes. In fact, the first time I told somebody what it was and what I did, I do it, and what after I found out about the actual term maladaptive daydreaming, it were two of my therapist friends. I told them about it. They received it beautifully, and it was really a very positive experience. And then for like the next week or so, I had a harder time staying focused in my daydreams. And that was very scary to me. I literally was like, well, I guess I'm never telling anybody again, because I'm not willing to lose this, you know? And since then I've kind of come to more of a middle ground with it.
I absolutely relate to that too. And especially because maladaptive daydreamers start the daydreaming behavior, whether it's maladaptive or not, so very young. Like, I mean, it just is part of your personal identity. It just is. It's always been there, whether it's been maladaptive or not. Like my world has always been there. My characters have always been there. It's just part of what I am. And even though I'm very like pro, you should get help, you should treat this. Like I'm also like not going to just let it go completely. I would never recommend that anybody just never daydreams. Um,
It's not even healthy. Yeah.
yeah. It's everybody's trying to do that balance where like you can keep the good parts that make you are part of who you are, while also getting rid of like the crap parts.
Right. Yeah. Having more control over it so it doesn't control you.
It is. Yeah. It would be like losing an arm to just suddenly not daydream.
Yes, absolutely. I wonder, yeah, what other people do with their time sometimes. I think I've heard people just in the last few days as I've been looking over the Discord, people ask that a lot, and I too ask that. I don't totally know, because on my drives home, like when I'm making dinner, falling asleep, whatever, it's just always an option for me. And also, I feel very attached to my characters. And I think most people do if they have, distinct characters in their daydreams. And so that would feel like a huge multiple times over death to me to lose those characters.
I'm going to derail us again and just shoot into an unrelated topic. Well, I mean, not unrelated. Everything here is about your perspective as a therapist. So, okay. People, they can be nervous. I don't want to say afraid, maybe afraid, but nervous to approach like a mental health professional or a therapist with something like this. And, and like we touched upon before, like the person may not have even heard of it or, might just brush it off or whatever. And and especially for people who've never been to a therapist before.
Mm-hmm.
Like if this is their first interaction with a therapist, you don't even know what to expect going into it. You don't know what to even say. Like if you had to write a copy pasta for a maladaptive daydreamer to send to their new therapist, what would it say?
No, I think that's a great question. So what you're asking to clarify is how the maladaptive daydreamer should present, like what they should say about themselves or what they should expect in the therapy session.
Well, I guess kind of both. Like I've never sat down for therapy or anything. I wouldn't know what to expect going in. Like what's an intake? I guess sort of in general gonna look like, and what sort of should you hit on to? Because we give people all kinds of advice. Like some people say, like, don't call it maladaptive daydreaming. Like just explain your symptoms. And some people say, like you said earlier, bring them papers that have it emblazoned in the title.
Mm-hmm.
Just sort of an approach to be taken seriously.
Absolutely, yes. And I hate this because so much of it. I mean, this is hard. This is unfortunate to have to say, but unfortunately, there are some not so great therapists out there, and there are some great therapists out there. And some of it's a function of personality and how you click, right? And that matters. That matters a lot. Actually, the research out there shows that the number one factor in whether therapy is going to be helpful for you in reaching your goals, whatever your goals are, whatever you're coming with, whatever you're wanting to get out of it, the number one factor is how strong your relationship with your therapist is and how safe you feel talking to them. Like the actual relationship, regardless of what you're talking about, regardless of the type of therapy they're doing, because there's so many different kinds. And that is wild to me because I would think that it would be more a function of like what kind of therapy they're doing, or if they know about your diagnosis, if they're an expert in your diagnosis. And that's not the case, actually. So I don't know if that's relieving or not, but for me, it kind of feels a little bit relieving when I think about going to therapy for the first time. So what can people expect? People can expect to not find their perfect therapist on the first try. That's normal. To meet with somebody, give it a few sessions, and then feel like, I don't think this is a good fit for me. You don't even have to have a specific reason. It can just not be, and that's okay. Therapists understand that. They don't take it personally. And if they do, that's a major issue, and that's on them. So see it like that. See it like you're testing something out, with a kind of like a return policy. That's way more normal than you would think. So, if you're nervous about putting the word maladaptive daydreaming out there, then don't do it. That's okay. You don't have to do that. And normally there's like intake paperwork that you'll be given beforehand to fill out, and you don't have to put that on there. Or you can say, there's this thing, I'd like to talk about it more, because normally it'll say, what are you wanting help with? Something along those lines. And you can list as much or as little as you want. I have people fill out my intake paperwork all the time, actually, and say, like, we'll talk about it in the session. They'll just write that. I'm like, okay, works for me. So, yeah, once you get in, I would really encourage you to try to see it as less of somebody who's like this professional expert person who's judging you and trying to make some kind of like determination about you, and more of like two people, ultimately you're actually the expert in your life, not the therapist, but two people who are like feeling each other out, trying to see if they can work together well. That's much more of what the dynamic should be like. So you're trying to fill this person out as much as they're trying to fill you out. And it is very normal for people not to unload, feel comfortable sharing like the depths of what they're there for in the first session. So also take it at your own pace. What an intake session should look like, sometimes they'll be a little bit longer than a normal session. My intakes are normally like between 50 minutes and 60 minutes. And my normal sessions are closer to 45 minutes. But the therapist should talk to you about your rights as a patient. They should talk about confidentiality and how important that is to them and what that looks like. They should talk about how to get in touch with them if you need them. What this is going to look like moving forward. They might talk a little bit about how they see therapy or how they see people. And all this is information for you to be absorbing and thinking through, is this a good fit for me? So then the therapist typically, it differs, but typically is going to try to collect some really general information about you and what brings you in. And you are in control of how much you share during that time. And so I'm talking about things like your family history, and if you do have any diagnoses that have been given to you previously, if you're on any medications. Also, like, what are things you do for fun? Like, tell me about your friends. Do you have good friendships? Is that part of your life? What do you want for yourself? What are your goals? The way I ask that question is, if this could be helpful for you in any way, therapy, then how would your life look different afterwards? How would you know that this was helpful to you? What would look different about your life? So this is the time for you, again, to be like creating a vision really for how this could be helpful to you. And then the therapist hopefully will kind of propose how they're going to be able to help you do that. So it should be very collaborative. It should be that way. And if it doesn't, I hope that you'll feel free to respectfully let the therapist know that you don't feel like it's a good fit, but thank you for your time, that kind of thing. Okay. So yeah, part of that is just, again, however much you want to talk about it, you should talk about it. I personally, I would very much appreciate somebody who came in with research. That'd be very exciting for me, actually. And I think most people I know, most therapists I know would feel the same way. But again, if you're looking for somebody who is maybe trauma informed, like I talked about before, then if you just talk about your symptoms and if you talk about what's going on for you, they're hopefully going to be really, really open to that and looking at what are your goals for yourself and how can we actually move towards some of those goals together.
Which paper, like which paper is most impressive to you or most useful to you as a therapist? Like if you were going to bring a paper to your therapist, which one would you pick?
Oh gosh, that's a really great question. Probably, okay, so the one you guys did the episodes on is a good one for sure. I'd bring a recent one. I wouldn't bring the original. Not because it's not a good paper, but just because the more recent research is going to be more helpful. I can't even think. Hold on, I actually have some of them right here. Let me really see if I.
Oh my God, are you a dork like me? Do you print out
Yes.
papers? Yeah, I go to the
You have
library and I
no
print them
idea.
out.
You want to know something that's really funny, and maybe you could edit this part out, but when I was at work printing these out, and I had like a printer issue, and so I had to get on the line with like our tech people, and so he could see what I was trying to print. It was like 20 maladaptive daydreaming articles. And he was like, wow, you're really kind of getting into that one thing, aren't you? And I was like, you have no idea. You know what? Let me get back to you on that because I want to make sure I'm thinking about the right one. Maybe I could give you like 2 or 3 that you could just like link to or something.
The one we did the episode on. Oh, do you know how to say that word? The phenomenology. Me and Levi were stumbling over it the whole episode.
Phenomenal. Whatever. Yeah.
We edited it out of most of the podcast because we said it like good once.
That is so funny.
Oh my god. That was fun.
Yeah, let me send you a few that I think that maybe you can just like link to as possible ones to bring to.
No problem. Yeah, we'll drop some links for people down in the description of the episode.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, the gist of meeting with your therapist for the first time is you're in a lot more control than you think you are, first of all. And you can always find a new therapist, and that's very normal. And yeah, share as much about yourself and your situation as you feel comfortable with, and don't feel nervous. Like I wish that when I told that first counselor about my daydreaming, and it was a serious thing for me because I was trying to decide if that was going to kind of be a deal breaker as far as me becoming a therapist myself. And I wish that I would have said to him when he kind of started saying, "Oh no, sounds like you're just really creative. Sounds like you have a very vivid imagination." I wish I would have had something to hand him, first of all. But then on top of that, I wish I would have said, "Look, I understand this is something that maybe you don't know about. It's not super well known, but this is actually causing me quite a bit of distress in my life. And I would really like to be able to really talk about it. I don't think this is a normal level of creativity and imagination." And the key word there would be saying distress. Back to what I was saying about the DSM, that's in there, for pretty much every diagnosis for most of them. So when you say that word, that's kind of a cue that, okay, this is now something that needs to be addressed. So I wish I would have known to say that. Be just very upfront, Even if you don't know about it, I understand that, but this is causing me quite a bit of distress. And if you'd be willing to work on it with me and learn some about it, I'd really appreciate that. And if not, I can find somebody else. That's okay too.
Yeah, distress is kind of, because it's so intrinsic, is that the word? A part of like a diagnosis, like it's a prerequisite. You need to have that to be diagnosed with something. It kind of works almost as like a magic word,
Yeah.
A flag, that people, it makes people take notice, or clinicians take notice. But if you're not there yet, or if you don't know if it causes you distress, if you're going in to like find out if it does, like I think many people don't know when they should reach out to a professional.
Mm-hmm.
Like at what point, if you have let's just say someone's been in your care for, I don't know, like a year, and they're a maladaptive daydreamer, but they don't know if they want to bring it forward to you. And one day they do. Like, where are you hoping in that process that they will be? I mean, do you want to catch them before it's bad, so they should bring it up even if they're just an immersive daydreamer? Do you like I don't know where I'm going, like, how to describe this, but like, when should someone bring it up?
I mean, I really think that's very dependent on the person. I don't know that I can say that because, yes, I hear what you're saying that that distress is a subjective thing, and not everybody feels like they're in distress. So maybe should they come in earlier to avoid the distress? Yes, if they think they should, then yes, totally, they should. And again, any therapist that is somebody that is worth seeing, on a somewhat long-term basis, is going to be open to talking about this with you in a non-invalidating way, right? Not minimizing it, really being curious about it, even if you're saying it's not causing me intense distress, but I might be nervous about that happening, in the future. And the research that you bring in, if you choose to do that, will, again, probably support it is going to help them to kind of see I don't know if lifespan is the right word, but of the thing, like of the disorder, if we want to call it that. So yes, you should go in if you are not in total distress, but maybe just concerned about that. But, it's also okay if you don't go in until you're in distress. Like, that's just a very personal choice, I think, is what I'm trying to get at. I don't know that there's not like a point in time where this is exactly when you should seek help. Now, if you're ever feeling like hurting yourself, if you're having suicidal ideation or something like that, then definitely seek help immediately. That's always going to be the case. You can always call 911, go to an emergency room. Again, speaking for here in the US, reach out to a professional. That is kind of a line in the sand. Other than that, it's just so subjective, when people feel comfortable or when they feel like they would benefit.
I want to ask another question too, but the answer, you might not be able to ethically answer it. So if you can't, we'll just edit this out.
Okay.
There are a lot of people in positions where they just can't seek therapy. Maybe they are in a country where there is a heavy stigma, or maybe somebody else, a parent or a caregiver, is in charge of their healthcare and won't let them, or they can't trust this person to speak to them about it. Are there any resources, I guess, you would recommend to people who can't actually sit down with a therapist for some reason?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks for asking that. If I was to treat maladaptive daydreaming, like professionally, I would probably take a mindfulness route, most likely, which you guys have referenced a few times previously. But for those of you who are not aware, mindfulness is it's not new, it's actually ancient. But as far as like coming on the therapy scene, the modern therapy scene, it's a little bit newer. But it's really an ancient practice of focusing your attention. It's all about your attention and gaining control over that. And what that looks like practically is paying attention to the present. So there's all kinds of ways you can do that. And it's a very powerful skill to build across the board for many, many things, not just maladaptive daydreaming. But of course, you can see how it would really benefit somebody who experiences maladaptive daydreaming, because you're giving yourself more control and you're reminding yourself that you're in the present, and you're practicing gently and non-judgmentally bringing yourself back here so that, again, you have more control over it. So that's something you can cultivate and practice regardless of if you're in therapy. Therapy helps with that because someone's going to be kind of coaching you, hopefully. But you can look up resources for mindfulness on the internet if you have internet access, really, pretty much anywhere, I would think, I would hope. And as far as mindfulness resources, I would really recommend just honestly like Googling a mindfulness strategies or mindfulness techniques. And there are so many things that will come up that will help you use your senses and your breath to bring yourself back to the present. And it's just a daily practice. There's just so many small practices that you can engage with, even if you're not in therapy.
That is it for this episode of Parallel Lives. Thank you so much for tuning in and for listening. We appreciate your time as always, and we hope you enjoyed the episode. This will actually be the season finale, and we will be back next year in February.
February 1st. Yep. We'll record something the last week of January, have it out for February 1st. In the meantime, we won't be entirely gone. We're going to post clips over the winter holidays.
And so if you would like to be a guest, or if you'd like to be part of the audience while we record these podcasts in the future, please feel free to join the Discord server and assign yourself the podcast role, and you'll get notified of when we'll be recording our next episode and what the topic would be on. And yeah, if you'd like to support us, please subscribe, follow, like, share, and comment if possible, wherever you're listening or tuning in. And yeah, thanks again for listening. Goodbye.
Did you just make that up? Like, was that just off the top of your head?
I've just done so many outros that I'm like, okay, now I know what to say, but now it's just like finding the right words and not stumbling over them.
I thought it was great. Gosh, that's probably the smoothest part of the whole thing.